Welcome to Conversations. I'm Muqtedar Khan, and as you can see, I have with me the distinguished economist, Dr. Santosh Mehrotra, with us. For those of you who have been watching Conversations regularly, he is not a new person. He has been on this show quite frequently. Dr. Santosh Mehrotra has a very wide experience. He has worked for international organizations. He has worked for India's Planning Commission, and he has taught on multiple continents. In the last few months that I've known him, he has taught in Egypt, in Italy, in Russia, and now he's teaching in UK. So he's a professor at the moment at Bath University. He's also taught in India. And so today we are going to ask some fundamental questions about the Chinese economic miracle, China, where China is going, and what is the impact of China on the global economy. And in the end, if we do have time, we will also look at India-China economic relations. So welcome to Conversations, Dr. Mehrotra.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. It's always a pleasure and an honor.
So the story of China is quite remarkable, Dr. Mehrotra. In preparation to this, I was reading some preambles in books, and they say that this has been never in history have we seen such sustained economic growth. So for more than 2 decades, China has on an average over 10% of growth, which is just stunning. I can understand that as a developing country in the 80s and 90s with a small GDP, it had a high growth rate. That is fine. Guyana has 40% growth rate now after discovering oil suddenly. So, but to be able to sustain that high rate of growth over 2-3 decades is also not just about China, it's also about globalization because it coincided with the global liberalization. But now we are entering a new phase. There are lots of theories about why China's growth rate has dropped to 4%. And so I want to start by, if you could please tell us, for those of us who are not that familiar with the Chinese economy, as to what is the miracle of the Chinese economy? What did the Chinese do right to be able to sustain such phenomenal growth? And what are their strengths, really?
I have to start with the post-independence history of China, post-revolution history of China, because the strengths that you ask about actually begin there after 1950. Because one of, three great contributions of the Maoist era from 1950 to about 1980 were the following. The three were very significant investments in education of the vast majority of the population of that country. And please remember, this is a bigger country than India is, and its total population was the largest in the world at that point, 550 million in 1950. The second big achievement of the communist period under Mao was the investment in health services. Public health services improved dramatically. And the third big investment, of course, was in the land reform that were carried out. Of course, there were significant costs of that as well in terms of lives lost, because it was done with excessive brutal methods. But at the same time, the collectivization and the equalization of land ownership by the establishment of collective farms and of state farms ensured that land, which is the one asset in a poor economy that poor people have, is equally distributed across the population and across all types of households, regardless of class, becomes a very important basis then for preparing the economy, in a sense, for the post-Mao period. What do I mean by that? You see, when the economic reforms begin in 1979, and most of our conversation and the growth rate that you're talking about happens after that, because the growth rate of the economy, the GDP growth rate, per capita income growth rate, is not much different from that of India over that period. So both China and India were at the same level of per capita income between around 1990, 1995. Anyway, but the big difference with India was precisely these three investments which were made early on, which made it possible for growth to be equitably distributed when GDP growth began after 1980, meaning rapid growth began. And you were so right in pointing out in your introduction that China's story is nothing short of a miracle in human history. Because never in modern human history or ever in human history has any economy grown at the rate that China has displayed over the last 30 to 35 years, 9 to 10% per annum. And they also, on account of the investments that I spoke about just now, the three investments, they managed to rapidly bring the growth rate of their population down also. It's a misunderstanding among people that they think that the one-child policy, which was introduced around 1980, was the reason for reduction of population growth rate. No, the population growth rate had already fallen sharply by 1980 for the simple reason that the demand for children among poor families, including rural families, had itself fallen. And you see, above all, it's the demand for children among households themselves that falls off when you ensure, the children don't die, infant mortality drops. And they don't need to have children just for social security, because your social security was assured. That was okay. Anyway, so I want to reinforce your point about and now we can begin to talk about what the sources of that growth were, if that's what you'd
Sure,
like me
sure.
to talk about.
Like what were the drivers? See, so, for example, if
Yeah,
you were
that's
to
right.
ask me what was the most critical turning point in India's story, it would be 1991 liberalization, coinciding with the collapse of the Soviet Union and globalization. 1991 was critical. What is critical to China? Because China
Yes,
started growing a little before 1991, right? Before the
you're
collapse.
right. You're absolutely right. And I think it's important for us to uh, explain the 1980s success story of China before we turn to the post 1990 period. You see, their economic reforms did begin in 1979. And the first thing that Deng Xiaoping did, because by now Mao was dead, um, and Zhou Enlai, who was the prime minister, had also passed away, and Deng Xiaoping, who had been who was under the clouds during the Cultural Revolution of the mid 70s, actually emerged as a great new leader, and you see, the first focus for the first 10 years after the economic reforms was on agriculture. I just told you about the success of the collectivization, but at the same time, the enormous success now post 1980 was the decollectivization, which was done progressively after a pilot. Now, this is a very important point I'm about to make. They did a pilot in two of their township and county governments in rural areas before they decided that the household responsibility system for distributing land was going to be successful. What was the household responsibility system? Because the decollectivization, along with the disbanding of the state farms, resulted in the following. What Beijing decided was the following: that every family will be given a plot of land, and so most plots of land were given on an equitable basis. Again, very important, equitable basis. For a 30-year lease period, the land was still continued to be owned by the government, but the land was now leased to the household. They could not sell it, but they could pass it on to the next generation. Now, the release of entrepreneurship and the ingenuity and labor input that happened as a result of the household responsibility system had a remarkable effect on agricultural productivity, agricultural incomes, because all that they had to do was to give a certain amount of the output to the state, which ensured that workers could be fed in the cities, and that was the responsibility of the state. But the more important point was output in every product area in agriculture rose. Hence, across the board for 10 years, the incomes and productivity rose. Now, this is a very important development because India never experienced this kind of agricultural revolution. Let me just explain very briefly in this context that all the Southeast Asian countries and even Korea, Taiwan, etc., experienced land reform, and their growth rate from 1950 in agriculture to 1980 for that 30-year period was something like 6% per annum. Now, 6% growth rate in East Asia for a 30-year period in agriculture is truly remarkable. Because,
Yeah.
for instance, by contrast, in India, the growth rate of agriculture has been
Three and a
nothing
half.
more than 3.2% per annum.
Even now,
In no decade has it.
yeah.
You're absolutely right. So, you see, that enabled incomes to grow among the vast majority of the population who were still rural. And so the agrarian revolution precedes the industrial revolution, which is exactly what happened in the now rich countries of the so-called OECD countries, that an agrarian revolution preceded the industrial revolution. And this enables equitable growth to take place. Now, let me return to what happened with industry, because the growth rate of the economy could not have been as high as you began by telling us, and rightly so, after 1980 without an industrial revolution. So then they started opening up doing the industrial reforms. They invited foreign direct investment in the early 90s. So while 80 to 90 was spent on agriculture, from 90 onwards, they started doing opening up the economy for foreign direct investment. They started to privatize and close down state-owned enterprises. They began, you see, in rural areas, there had been a massive success. This must also be remembered. In the 1980s, there was a massive success of industrial growth in rural areas on account of what are called township and county enterprises, TVEs. These were originally owned by the state, but slowly they had begun to be privatized, and they have since the last 30 years been entirely owned by private entrepreneurs. And these were very dynamic. You see, unlike the small scale sector in India, which has rarely ever been dynamic, these enterprises were very dynamic. So this is the sequence which enables them to ensure equitable growth. This is one reason why they are able to have such rapid growth. Because you see, the agrarian reform creates the demand for industrial products. In our country, this is the problem, that demand from the rural areas is still quite tepid. It was quite high in the first decade of the current century, but this has been the case in China for the longest time, and this is extremely important for sustaining 9% growth, 10% growth, because unless demand is growing, no investment will be successful.
What made those industries more dynamic?
I'm coming to that.
Yeah.
This is a very important question that needs to be understood by your viewers. And I'm going to point to a paradox, Dr. Khan, about China, and I will contrast that to India. Let's remember that China is a one-party state.
Yeah.
China has 30 provinces, but it has a unitary constitution. It is not a federal constitution, right?
Yeah.
So two very big differences with India. India is a multi-party democracy. China is a one-party state. Secondly, China has a unitary constitution. India has a federation and a federal constitution. It's the union of states, as our constitution says.
Like the US.
Like the US, like Germany, like Brazil, like Australia, and so on. They're all large countries like Russia. Now, the interesting difference is in the third dimension between China, and I think this goes to the heart of the question you just asked. And that is this: although we are the democracy, we are the federation, we are more fiscally centralized than China is. China, despite being a one-party state, a unitary constitution, is more fiscally decentralized. That is the paradox, and this in the literature, both by China scholars as well as international scholars, this is the foundational reason why the growth was driven by these township and county governments, because township and county is the lowest level of government, Dr. Khan. You have Beijing, you have the provinces, but it's the township and county governments which account for over 50% of all public expenditure by any level of government. This is the kind of thing you would find in a rich country. And here, this was a developing country 35 years ago, which has now become a country which is a upper middle income country on the verge of becoming high income. It's still not a high income country, China is, but the point is the explosion of growth tax that takes place is on account of the industrialization that is encouraged by this fiscal decentralization. The literature very clearly establishes the following relationship. You see, what the Beijing government did was that it said to the township and county governments, we are fiscally decentralizing, meaning if you mobilize tax revenues from within your county, you will be allowed to retain 80, 90, in even higher percentages of that revenue. You don't have to transfer it to either the province or to us. And this had a massive incentivization effect on each township. So township and county governments were competing with each other for inviting foreign direct investment as well as the new private entrepreneurs that were emerging. Because please remember that, this is a country which had only state-owned enterprises, and township and county governments were, and township TVEs, the township and village enterprises themselves were only just beginning to be privatized. So they attracted, these local governments attracted a lot of investment into industry, and the more investment they attracted, the more revenues for the state, for the local government, the more revenues local government would then plow back into infrastructure and improving quality of infrastructure. So you see the beautiful dynamic here. And these local governments would compete with each other. This is what drove the very remarkable growth of 9 to 10% per annum. And so, in other words, fiscal decentralization is a one big lesson for large developing countries, including ours. Now, we had our own reasons for being centralized, but maybe you can ask your next question.
4 years ago, I did a project on good governance, and I'm not remembering the title of the article, but it was an ebook that I put together of several articles, and one of them was on China's growth. And the professor who wrote that piece, she argued that the consultative process at the local level created a kind of civil society, which is, even though China is not a democracy, it had the effect of a civil society. And so so there was an accountability to the public at the city governance level. And so she marveled at the idea as to why that's where the dynamism comes, right? You know what the local...
Absolutely. Accountability. You put your finger on it, Dr. Khan, because it's not just that the accountability comes from this fiscal decentralization, it also comes from the way the state and the party is structured. Let me explain a little bit about this.
Sure.
Because most outsiders don't understand this, and this sort of shows you the contrast with many other developing countries, including India. You see, the Communist Party is organized in such a way that it's fairly hierarchical, and the lower level officials, let us say the mayor of the township and county government, the mayor of the local government, would be evaluated on 3 dimensions. What are the 3 dimensions? Economic construction, social construction, and political construction. Now, there are 17 indicators for a total of 17 indicators under these three dimensions. And for each year, the hierarchy works like this, that senior officials would establish the output and outcome indicators for the township and county government, and 1 year later they would be evaluated upon it, and promotions would within the CPC would depend upon whether you achieve these outputs or outcomes under these three dimensions or not. You see, accountability. It's
Yeah.
not just that you've spent the money. Most accountability in India, for instance, by contrast, takes place through the mechanism. We allocated money to you at the beginning of the financial year. Have you spent it? That's an input based method of ensuring accountability. That doesn't ensure outputs or outcome.
Yeah.
It's exactly the opposite in there. So you see, this is a very important difference in the governance system and administrative account.
It's a performance-based system, right? It's performance.
Absolutely.
If you don't perform,
Absolutely.
like you're out of it.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
so there is one thing that is constantly, like when you read the literature, there are all these claims that there is false reporting on Chinese data and that China overstates its growth and its achievements, etc. Because ultimately, if you see, China is still a middle income economy. Its per capita is 13,000. It is not a high income economy. So, how much truth is there to this idea that China is not reporting things well and that its growth and its miracle is exaggerated?
I don't buy this. Let me explain why. Sorry for interrupting you, but I've heard this so often. Let me explain why. I've been going to China since 1995. Periodically, I go there, and as an economist, I have to say that your eyes pop out each time you go there, because you see new developments happening all the time. And it was, please try and understand that I think we've set up, they have set up, they have managed to create a very capable state. And it's important for all of us to understand that this capable state will not function and cannot remain as a one party state and as authoritarian as it is and not brooking too much opposition, unless they were also offering higher and higher quality of life and higher wages. So there are real differences which you see every 5 or 10 years if you visit. So even if there are some numbers in a year or two which might be not exactly what they are, the fact of the matter is that it's so visible. And let's remember that they are a very accountable state within themselves for their own purposes. And how would they keep their own people so happy by and large? And
yeah.
the other thing that I don't think is fully understood is that the transition from socialism to capitalism, and it is a capitalist economy, it's a fully market oriented economy, has been so well coordinated because the state has emerged as a very capable state. And I think the reasons I've explained earlier. Contrast this to what happened to the Soviet Union. Contrast this to the other East European countries. The transition economies, especially this, what became of Russia, not just the collapse of the Soviet Union into 15 republics, but the collapse of output and incomes over the entire 1990s, and the collapse of mortality. Adult male mortality rose dramatically in Russia in the 1990s. There's such a large body of literature contrasting the Chinese transition with the Russian or Soviet transition, and including the East European one. And if this doesn't open the eyes of those who are critical, then I don't know what else will.
So what has happened is that, like when we do like any equations and etc., you keep one variable constant and then you can play around with the other variable and see how things change. So what
Correct.
had happened with Russia and East European, where they were simultaneously trying to change the political system as well as the economy at the same time. Whereas in Russia,
Yes.
China, they kept the political system constant, whereas they changed the
Yes.
economy. And I think that is why you have a competent state which is able to
Yes.
make the transition economically,
Yes.
whereas in Russia and other places, you were dismantling the existing state.
Correct.
And
Correct.
at
You
the
are
same time, you
absolutely
are
right.
trying to build two things, and that was not happening.
You're spot on. You're spot on. I mean, I have to say that it's a great relief. I've now resumed going back to Russia in the last year or so, and I'm greatly relieved that Russia has come back up in the last 25 years. But the first decade and a half was a complete disaster for Russia, and and please note, your viewers should understand that in terms of per capita income, Russia and China are roughly at the same level. So
Yeah,
Russia last year,
became
amusingly, became a high income country primarily because its armaments production on account of the Ukraine war,
it's gone up.
Ukraine Russia war, had gone up, and therefore, so your point is it's a high upper middle income country like China is upper middle. And the two started at very different levels. Please,
That's
I
true.
mean, everyone must understand and appreciate.
To put
Yeah,
an aside, it was very amusing that last year, the two countries which were on the most under sanctions, Iran and Russia, they actually went up the World Bank ladder. Iran went from lower middle income to upper middle income, and Russia went from upper middle income to higher income economy
correct.
just last year. And I was looking at it and I found that quite amusing to say, right? That transition. So the China continues to see itself as a developing country, whereas now the rest of the world sees it as, as an alternative to the US from a system point of view, as a bipolar system, whether
Yeah.
it's a challenger to. Where do you see China as? Are the Chinese feel as if they have arrived, or this is just the beginning of their journey? Like, what is their? I can understand what their political vision and geopolitical vision is, but what is their economic vision? Like, what is
Let
driving?
me explain.
Yeah,
Let me explain to the extent that I understand it. Um, their economic vision still remains that they must become as soon as possible a high income country. And indeed, in the next 2 to 3 years, they will, on a sustainable basis, become a high income country. We'll come back to that shortly,
sure.
because obviously there are going to be impacts of the Trump tariffs, and I assume that you will probably ask me about that
Sure.
too. Uh, However, their own vision remains that they must become a high income country. However, it must also be remembered that one of the among many important factors that we've spoken about why China was able to continue to grow and has slowed in terms of GDP growth for the last 7 or 8 years is a demographic factor. And that is as follows, that they have run out of what is called the demographic dividend, meaning they have become an aging society from about 8 or 10 years ago. Their dividend ran out somewhere between 2012 and 2015. By contrast, India still has another 15 years to go for its demographic dividend. But the point for China is that for the last 8 or 10 years, and this is also part of the vision, Dr. Han, of the Chinese leaders, they have repeatedly been saying Europe became old after they became rich. We have become old without becoming rich. And please appreciate that they have grown extremely rapidly for 30 years from about 1980 onwards. And they have come to this juncture, and yet they feel they haven't become rich. And in a sense, they are right, because they have not managed to secure social security for all their workers. However, 65% of their workforce does have access to social security. They are part of the formal economy. the rest they are trying to cover. They will continue to cover that, and they have the fiscal wherewithal to be able to continue to do that. But inevitably, they will now rely increasingly on innovation uh, through their industrial economy in order to sustain growth. But the fact of the matter is that because they've run out of workers, wages have risen, and therefore there are limits to the growth rate, and that's why the growth rate has come down. Growth rate has also come down on account of mistakes because they allowed local governments, and this is part of the downside of the fiscal decentralization, which must be also recognized. They allowed local governments to borrow from both the four big banks, but also the local banks, and continue construction activity in their localities. Result is there has been over construction of housing in particular, and there are not enough takers for that. Population growth rates have fallen, and generally there has been a debt over leverage of the local government, and that has inevitably resulted. So there was a period of rapid growth when construction was happening on the basis of borrowing by local governments. That has stopped. There's over borrowing, and the risk always remains, and that's what the Western observers keep talking about. Oh, when is the Chinese debt bubble
Yes.
going to burst? When is the growth rate going to collapse? Well, the point is that even here the Chinese have belied all expectations of Western observers that the Chinese economy is going to go bust. What is happening is that there gradually slowdown has taken place, and this was practically inevitable. Yet the economy is still growing at 4.5% in the last quarter. You know that
Sure.
4.5 is not bad for an economy which is as already as large as it is.
Yes.
So the so really, what expectations we now have from this point onwards, Dr. Khan, is that the economy will grow at slow and slower rates at something like 3 to 4%. And now we can, if you wish, consider what might be the impact of Trump tariffs and all of that also.
Yes.
Right.
Dr. Mehrotra, I mean, this is a very clear understanding of the real estate bubble, which was contributing to 30% of the GDP growth.
Correct.
Even
Right.
in India, a lot of capex, as they call it, is driving
Correct.
the GDP. If the government was not spending, then the GDP went down to 5, if you remember, in one of the quarters,
Right.
because the
Right.
government could not
Correct.
invest a lot of money into
Quite
capital
right.
expenditure. So
Indeed.
the decline in China's growth rate could clearly be attributed to the decline in basically real estate investments and over investments in real estate. But the next question that I want to talk to you is that today's China's economy has some very weird factors. One is deflation, and domestic consumption has gone down, but they are still managing to grow at 4.5. In fact, I was looking at some of the data. The expectations are the last quarter was 5.2% growth. And they are able to do this because of this shift was export-oriented manufacturing in the last few years. How long is this sustainable, especially since the West is now coming for China's exports? You can see all this talk of de-risking, delinking, restructuring the supply chain, and also what I was wanted to talk about is the tariffs. The U.S. tariffs are designed basically to dismantle the structure of globalization, which enable Chinese growth and development.
You're right. Now, uh, please understand that it's not the first time that the Trump tariffs have come into being. They started in the Trump first term,
Yes.
and in April of 2018, already there was a trade war, a tariff war with China, which had commenced. And there were retaliatory action when the US Trade Representative was asked by President Trump to impose tariffs on China in particular. The Chinese reacted and imposed a countervailing tariff. Now, what is now happening? So, one of the reasons why the growth rate slowed was in China was precisely that the export growth that had been going on till the end of the second decade of this century began to slow on as the tariff war began in the first term of Trump, and then of course that process was not sort of reduced in any way by the Biden administration. So what China has done, like a good planned economy, and please understand that despite being a market economy, its NDRC, which is the equivalent of its planning commission, remains a very powerful body, and they have in place an industrial policy of upgrading every type of production, including in the area of high tech. We'll come back to that shortly. But the point is, they also began by preparing to reduce their exposure to the US market. Yes, the US market used to account for about 19% of total exports in 2020. That has already come down last year to 14% of total Chinese exports. So that was a planned reduction as a response to the fears that the Chinese had. And they have used that reduction to obviously diversify. They are exporting much more. They have strengthened their ties with the Southeast Asian, ASEAN countries. They have increased their exports to India. Their ties with, on account of the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, those exports have grown across Africa, across Asia, and of course also across Latin America. So the Chinese presence has grown on account of exports of goods and services all across the global south. That's how they have sustained growth. However, we are now in a stage or a phase of the tariff war between the two global giants, China and the United States, which is not going to leave either of the two large economies unscathed. So, for instance, there is a pause between the US and China in the trade war currently. We all know that. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, is apparently going to meet with the Chinese leaders in Stockholm on August the 12th, which is about 3 weeks away. And if no agreement is reached, tariff rates could reverse from the current 30%, around 30%, to spikes as high as 145% on US imports and 125% on Chinese exports. So clearly that risk remains. However, both sides, as you can already, I'm sure you're reading, have maintained a constructive tone. I mean, underlying issues persist, but the approach of China's Commerce Minister emphasizes ongoing dialogue. And he does not see any need for a restart of the trade war. So it may well be that there will be a potential summit diplomacy between President Xi and President Trump in October. And as the negotiations continue, they may, trim tariffs down to about 40%, down from around 40% to around 30% by year end. So the point is, talks are progressing. We'll have to wait to see what happens. Now, all of this does not mean there will not be impacts on both China as well as on the US economy. Let's just briefly talk about what the impacts on Chinese economy might be. Goldman Sachs has estimated that US tariffs are likely to be cutting about 2.6 percentage points off China's real GDP. and some of this would be occurring in 2025 already. So something like 2 to 3 percentage points growth decline may well be happening, may well be on its way. So what we have seen in this last quarter, we may not continue to see as we move forward. This is partly, of course, because export profitability is going to be hit, and we've seen this happening from 2018 onwards, because since data from 2019 onwards showed that Chinese firms lost around 0.35 percentage points in margins per 1% increase in tariff inclusive price. And so all of this is clearly going to have an impact. So high tariffs are clearly trimming China's economic growth. Effects on the US economy in some ways are going to be even greater. So let me explain what I mean. So there'll be an impact on growth rates in GDP. We've already been anticipating for the last 3-4 years there will be an impact to so far as to make induce a recession in China. Recession in the United States. Thankfully, talk of recession in the United States has come down because President Trump himself is moderating his trade war. I mean, we all know the taco phrase has been used for him. But we know that it's projected to shave off these tariffs and the retaliations are projected to shave off about 0.9% percentage point of the US GDP growth, and it'll reduce payroll jobs. About 640,000 jobs might be lost. Unemployment rate is likely to rise by about 0.5 percentage points. Clearly, consumers are already facing higher prices, and I mean, these are going to continue to impact the US economy, and these are already beginning to show up in the weekend agitations after agitations that have hit your country for the last several months.
Yeah,
all of which will probably impact the elections next year to the House of Representatives.
So let me ask you a question about this. It's like a more of a technical question. So
Sure.
many of these economies that I think what is frustrating Trump is the deficit more than anything else. And he feels
Correct.
the deficit is there because many of these economies do not open their economies to the US exports while the US is open for everybody's exports. So you can export everything to the US. There are very little restrictions on other countries. And so he's absolutely thrilled that Vietnam and Indonesia are now open to US exports. We can sell whatever we want there. For both India and China, what is more detrimental, higher tariffs on exports to the US or opening their agricultural and the dairy sector, even for Japan, to the US? Like, which could hurt them more?
Oh, the answer for that is actually fairly straightforward, Dr. Khan. I seriously doubt if either of the two economies, and especially India, which is much more agriculture dependent than in a sense the Indonesian economy is going to open up on its agriculture imports from the United States. There will be limited opening up, that's my understanding, for certain types of products which are not going to impact the production of milk. Let me explain, because that's the one big area. Maize is another, GM maize, corn is another, but I'll come back to that. You see, what so far the negotiations have been about rather high value agricultural produce which the United States wants to sell. For instance, almonds, walnuts. Now, almonds and walnuts is consumed by such a small proportion of the total population of India that it's not going to impact the vast majority of our farmers. A second thing that they are talking about is the export of cheese from the United States. Now, cheese, if it's exported, it's a processed milk product that will again, it's a very high value product. What proportion of Indian households consume cheese, and that too imported cheese? It's unlikely to lead to a great deal of demand. So while the Indian negotiators might open it up, uh, the
Will not
demand
impact.
itself is going to limit the imports. Okay. However, the big risk exists in respect of milk powder, powdered milk. Now, that is very unlikely that the Indian negotiators are going to relent on that. They will not relent. They are not going to. Clearly, it doesn't make much sense for the United States to try and sell milk proper to India. India is the largest producer of milk in the world, and the milk, if we were to import it from, regardless of how high the subsidies might be to the milk producers of the United States, the transportation costs will offset that, and so that's unlikely to happen. So my suspicion is that a trade deal may well be likely between India and the United States in the next few weeks. Um, and it may well also be that an interim deal might be announced before the 1st of August, and some outstanding issues may continue to be resolved over time.
To
So
prevent.
that's the way, yeah, that's the way it's likely to probably play out. So,
This is my final question. So if, unless the US and China can come to an understanding, is it safe to assume that the Chinese miracle will really, really slow down, and the Chinese dream of becoming a rich country could take a really, I mean, the time span could increase significantly, right? What they hope to achieve in 20 years, they may take 50 years to achieve.
oh, I don't think they're going to take 20 years, let alone 50 years. I think they will still get there, given how close they are to the 14,005 per capita at market exchange. They are already at very close to that level. And they will, even if you shave off 2 percentage points in their growth rate, they will still grow at 2%. And that's very significant. The more important point, Dr. Khan, is the following. They have already been rerouting exports that they were earlier selling to the United States, etc., to Southeast Asia and to Europe.
Yeah.
So China's total exports grew about 6% in the first half of 2025.
Yeah.
Even as the US shipments declined.
Yes, I agree.
So they have been strategically redirecting and the US is targeting their exports in such a way that firms have compensated by increasing shipments to other regions. I mean, yes, they have not fully offset the losses on account of the US market being lost. And yes, there are limits to diversification, but so the point here is that it will not impact their output so much as to slow their growth rate down significantly. And even if they were growing at 2%, 2.5% for the next 2 or 3 years, in 3 to 4 years, they are going to become a high income country, no question. By 2030, I'm saying that they are likely to become a high income country. And it's highly likely that after the negotiations reach final stages by October, a deal will be struck. We know finally that Trump does chicken out. He doesn't want the US economy to be severely impacted by a massive increase in tariffs and the inflationary impact that will have in the US economy. He cannot suffer that for domestic political reasons. The MAGA base is going to revolt.
Yeah,
so there are risks.
The risks are clear. I was looking at the dollar index. It has gone from 108 to 97. So the dollar is weakening, which means that it is inevitably going to lead to
Yes.
inflation, right? It's like automatic, really. Uh,
Yes.
Dr. Mehrotra, it was
Yes.
wonderful talking to you, and we have gone over an hour, but it's always a pleasure, and thank you for explaining to us. I think we will have to continue a little bit more of the conversations. Perhaps we'll come back after 1st of August to see where the chips fall with regards to the tariffs, especially on the Indian side of it, and then we will do a similar exercise on to what extent the final deal or the mini deal will have on India's economy and India's growth rate. So thank you very much for coming to conversations and talking to us, Dr. Mehrotra.
Always a pleasure, sir.